Okay, so we are going to talk about tic-tac-toe and how we figure out acid-base imbalance. So here we go. So when we're looking at pH, anything less than 7.35, and we know for sure that we have acidosis. So just with pH less than 7.35, that's acidosis. When we have a pH that is 7.35 to 7.45, we are hopefully in homeostasis, but there is something we'll talk about in a little bit where you're actually in an acid-base imbalance. You're just fully compensated. So we will get into that in just a little bit. When our pH is greater than 7.45, we know 100% that we are in alkalosis. When our PaCO2 is greater than 45, because it's converted into carbonic acid, that is considered acidosis. That does not mean that we are in respiratory acidosis. It could mean that our lungs are compensating for our metabolic disorder. When our PaCO2 is between 45 and 35, that is considered normal. So we know that our problem is not a respiratory problem because our PaCO2 is normal. And we also know that our lungs are not yet interested in compensating because our PaCO2 is normal. When our PaCO2 is less than 35, that means that our lungs are blowing off CO2 at a higher rate. So we have less carbonic acid being created. So now that would be considered an alkalytic level. So it could be that we are in respiratory alkalosis, or it could just be that our lungs are trying to compensate for those darn kidneys or whatever our metabolic issue is. So when our HCO3 is less than 22, that is the amount of bicarb we have in our system, that is our base. If it is less than 22, we are in acidosis, and it would be metabolic acidosis, or our kidneys are compensating for our respiratory problem. When our HCO3 is 22 to 26, that means that there is not a metabolic issue causing our acid-base imbalance, but it also means that our kidneys are not compensating yet for our acid-base imbalance. And when our HCO3 is greater than 26, so the amount of bicarb in our body is more than the norm, then we are either in metabolic alkalosis, or our kidneys have chosen to respond to our respiratory disorder and compensate for respiratory acidosis. Just looking at our pH, we know this is acidosis. Put that X there, that is what is causing acidosis. That middle X means there's no compensation for our acidosis. Whenever you put the X over to the other side into alkalosis, we know that there's compensation for this acidosis. Then whenever your pH flips over to normal, but still on the low side of normal, we know that it is fully compensated acidosis. So your pH is still 7.35 to 7.38. Okay, so now our pH would be greater than 7.45. So we are in alkalosis. And so the X there with the pH would be our cause. So we'll have to look at our other values. So this would be alkalosis without compensation because we have one abnormal with our pH, but our other value is normal, no compensation. Now we have partial compensation because there are 3 total abnormal values, but the partial compensation is for alkalosis because our pH is in alkalosis. Now we have full compensation because our pH is normal, but our other two values are abnormal and on the opposite side of each other. So what you have to do is look at which value is in alkalosis, because pH is 7.42 to 7.45. Just because pH is on the high side of normal, yes, we're normal, but that just means that we are fully compensated. So when we look at our lab values, pH, we have a pH less than 7.35. Then we look and our HCO3 is less than 22. Let's say it's 20. So now we know pH, we're in acidosis, and look at that, the HCO3 tells us it's metabolic acidosis. Once we know that it's metabolic acidosis, the last thing we're going to do is look at our PaCO2 and see what our lungs think about the fact that we're in metabolic acidosis. So if our PaCO2 is normal, like it is right here, then we're in metabolic acidosis with no compensation, because our lungs aren't doing anything to compensate for the fact that we're in metabolic acidosis. So now our PaCO2 has shifted over into alkalosis. So now we are in partial compensation because our pH is still considered acidotic. What have our lungs done to compensate? So this is where we start to breathe deeper and faster. We call this Kussmaul respirations. That is your compensation. So now our pH has shifted into the normal range, but it is still 7.35 to 7.38. So it is on the low side of normal, which shifts us over. We are still in acidosis. So it's metabolic acidosis with full compensation, because our lungs have managed to compensate enough that they've brought our pH back to the low side of normal. Because our pH is normal and we have two odd values, we have full compensation. So we have metabolic acidosis with full compensation. So for the rest of this video, I'm going to let you guys practice kind of figuring out what your acid-base imbalance is, and then figuring out if there's compensation and if there isn't compensation. So just kind of follow along and see if you can figure out what's going on. I would recommend pausing if you need more time. The acid-base imbalance here is respiratory acidosis with no compensation. Pause if you need more time. The acid-base imbalance here is metabolic alkalosis with no compensation. Pause if you need more time. The acid-base imbalance here is respiratory alkalosis with no compensation. Pause if you need more time. The acid-base imbalance here is metabolic alkalosis with partial compensation. Pause if you need more time. The acid-base imbalance here is respiratory acidosis with partial compensation. Pause if you need more time. The acid-base imbalance here is respiratory alkalosis with partial compensation. Pause if you need more time. The acid-base imbalance here is metabolic alkalosis with full compensation. Pause if you need more time. The acid-base imbalance here is respiratory acidosis with full compensation. Pause if you need more time. The acid-base imbalance here is respiratory alkalosis with full compensation.